Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. You might not know it, but we're here to see the light. And this is serious because this session, Into the Dark, is all about shining a light on one of the world's most challenging topics. We are very fortunate to have world-leading experts on several nuances of this issue here with us today. I'll start with Mr. Sérgio Moro. Sérgio Moro today is probably the world's most known corruption fighter, if I could call. A former judge, today a Minister for Justice and Public Security in Brazil. Moro, from your experience, can we know the exact scale and magnitude of organized crime? I think knowing the problem is part of being able to disrupt it. So how would you say, what's the scale and magnitude of organized crime today?
I think it's very difficult to do that because usually you cannot measure very well crime. A lot of part of criminal activity goes into the shadows. But in general, we have strong perceptions about the risks of organized crime. I think organized crime is a problem all over the world. In Brazil, it's a big problem. We have this criminal organization usually based on state prisons. Some leaders also in federal prisons, and they are powerful and they are violent. We have recently an episode in Brazil where some organizations in a state in the north of Brazil called Ceará started riots, acts of violence, like arsons, because they want to pressure the government to don't fight with them, don't make the prison system more rigid. So it's a large problem everywhere. What is necessary? Of course, in every country, we need to fight back, of course, with rule of law, respecting human rights. But if the resources are limited, we need to focus then on organized crime. Okay, some countries like Italy against the Cosa Nostra, United States against the 5 mafia families of New York, they have been successful addressing organized crime. This organization still exists, but not anymore as the same strength. The other countries have to do the same.
When we just look at all these silos, I would like to ask Minister Moro, you just led a major anti-money laundering investigation with the international implications. So what would be the main lessons for international cooperation from from a case that started locally but just had so many international implications?
I think there are some things that could be improved on that area. Nowadays, a lot of countries have a lot of mutual agreements or multilateral agreements, but sometimes these agreements doesn't not work in practice. They are used sometimes like a piece of paper to say, oh, you have agreement, I will cooperate. But in practice, it's very difficult. Maybe one way to improve the relationship between law enforcement personnel from one country to another is to create joint teams. Yes, confidence, trust between law enforcement personnel is very important. And sometimes it's difficult for someone in Brazil to trust in someone in another country or vice versa. Also, I really think that the private sector could do more on this issue. I also remember a case that I have in the past. We are investigating money laundering in Brazil, and some professionals in money laundering used a branch of a state bank in Miami to launder money for politicians, for businessmen, for criminals, for everyone, to be honest. They usually don't separate this sort of things. They are not worried about. And at that time, it was 2004, we don't have a mutual agreement with the United States. And this bank, Brazilian bank, with a branch in Miami, we approached the bank, and the bank itself requests a court order in a United States court to get a judicial authorization to take the bank records and deliver it to Brazilian law enforcement. I realize that nowadays the international cooperation is based in cooperation between governments, cooperation between law enforcement personnel. But is this really necessary? If you are a corporation in the private sector, if you are, if you don't want that your company be used for criminal purpose, usually you want to cooperate. You could cooperate with your national law enforcement, but maybe building some basic measures. You could also cooperate with law enforcement authorities from other countries. Why you need to follow all the diplomatic channels? If you need that, when you need usually coercive measures to take a deposition, to take bank records, to get this kind of evidence. But if the cooperation is voluntary, maybe you could work directly with law enforcement personnel of other countries. Maybe that it would be a way to, how can I say, to improve international cooperation, not only between governments, but between law enforcement personnel from a country to corporations of another country. I really think this is a possibility. I also make a suggestion here in that PASSE initiative. For example, if you are committed to cooperate, if you are committed to not let your company become a haven to criminals, you should cooperate. You should do more than just write moral principles in your corporate manuals. You need to do more. And to be honest, this is good not only for international cooperation, it's good for the companies, it's good for profits, it's good for the people, it's good for everyone.
Moro, when you talk about following the money, and of course this I think was the thread that led to the anti-corruption Lava Jato, which is the car wash, how do you think these tools could be applied to fighting the same drug factions that you were mentioning in the beginning? So the organized crime, the real one on the streets. I mean, we know they're all interlinked, but can we use the same tools? Are we? What else is missing there that we can't? We didn't find out yet how to really just dismantle these groups.
Well, there is no magic against these organized crime groups. As I said earlier, you need resources. I think the best strategy is to creating a task force. You need technology. I think this is very important. And you have that classical approach. You need effective investigation to get strong evidence against the leaders. Then you have to isolate the leaders, usually in prisons with high security levels. You have to dismantle the organization, not only sending to prison the other members, but also forfeiting their assets. sometimes it's difficult to follow the money. It's not that simple. But they work as other criminals works. The money have to go to somewhere. But let me say a little more about what my suggestion before. I was thinking here about the technology that used in cars, Uber. Mm-hmm. And you have, in the past, license for taxis. Yeah. Then you have a platform, a digital platform. Then you don't need anymore the government to say that they are reliable. I was thinking about something similar. You have maybe a digital platform, so corporations go in this platform and they say, "Oh, we are available to cooperate with law enforcement personnel all around the world. We not necessarily you need cooperation by our government." Like that example that I said there, let's think about a bank in Brazil who has a branch in another country, and I know that this branch has evidence that I needed, bank records, for example. Why don't thinking about going to this platform, this bank is in this platform, and this bank provide obtaining authorization from their courts, or the courts on of the country where the evidence is held, and the bank itself provide what the law enforcement really need. Maybe it's something that we could think about to do something different, because, as I said, we have a lot of mutual agreements. Sometimes they are on a piece of papers. They don't work in practice. Mm. And as I said, if corporations are talking serious about cooperation with law enforcement and avoid any kind of involvement with criminals, they could cooperate more. The criminals don't know boundaries. Corporations usually don't know even. Only governments have these problems. So corporations could cooperate more in voluntary means.
So now I would like to take some questions, please. If you could introduce yourself.
I own a company called Head, which does sporting goods, and I have some other corporate activities. But I was also a member of the British government for a while as the Prime Minister's special representative on climate change, which got me in contact with countries where these problems were very prevalent in South America, Africa, and the Far East. And Mr. Moro touched on one very important point, and that is if you want to trace money from organized crime, it's usually too late when you get the answers, because it's a process that takes a very long time. And if you try to circumvent it, in many jurisdictions, if you have obtained the information illegally, your case falls flat. And in my experience, there is a necessity to have a global treaty that addresses this, because to address organized crime, the only way to do that is to cut off the money, in my opinion. So I would very much like to hear the panel's opinion on how that could be achieved.
We don't want problems with the exclusionary rule. That's not what I was talking. I was just talking that maybe sometimes if you cannot use the mutual agreements channels, the diplomatic channels, maybe you could use something different. For example, if a corporation for another country voluntarily cooperate with law enforcement personnel of other country, there's no problem with the evidence. It's different from having evidence without a warrant or without a probable cause. For example, I know that this this employee of this corporation, he could be involved in criminal activity. It would be valuable for me to have a statement, a deposition. The corporate itself could provide the deposition if necessary, requesting an authorization for a court, or maybe it's not even necessary to do this. So you would improve international cooperation. Because to be honest, there are some countries that really does not cooperate in practice, even when you have a mutual legal agreement. Sometimes the fault is on the poor quality of the international request, but sometimes it's the problem of a lack of goodwill.
Can I just one point about just to reinforce what Jürgen was saying about the use of AI and machine learning in some of our work as well with the police in the UK, that we found they weren't exploiting the large amounts of data available to them. And so I think making better use, and there's a lot of AI expertise here at Davos as well.
Sure. Any other question?
I'm Cristina from Brazil. Brazilian Central Bank is proposing to stop financial monitoring of politicians' relatives. I would like to ask the panelists, what is the rule in countries like Germany and the UK, and what is Minister Moro's personal opinion, please?
Well, I read in the newspapers today about this question, but as far as I know, what I read is that it's just a public consult. It's not an actual measure. So respecting the rulers of the central bank, we have to understand better why they are proposing such kind of measure. I really believe that they have and we are not talking about the actual government. We are talking about rulers of the central bank from the former government, because the president was not changed yet. Okay, so we have to understand better why they are proposing this, and then we could maybe discuss with them if it's really a good idea. But I really believe that maybe they are not proposing the right thing, but they have good intents.
Would you like to comment, Jürgen?
No, not really, because I mean we are not entering into national issues. We provide a platform for police cooperation which can be used. So I think the other panel members are in a much better position to.
It's not. It's about that special attention directed by the financial system to financial records of politicians, and they are trying to discuss the actual rule about relatives of politicians. But it's too soon to have a conclusive statement about this proposition. It was open to the public, just that.
There's one more question here in the front.
Lourdes Casanova from Cornell University. It was yesterday that Moises Naim mentioned this statistic, 8:31. So Latin America concentrates 8% of the world population, and 1 in 3 of the homicides in the world take care in Latin America. The explanations were around inequality, poverty, but if we look at India, for instance, has many more poor, but the statistics show that it's a much, much safer country. Also, democracy like Latin American countries. Inequality, we have inequality in many other parts of the world. Any other number one, reasons and possible solutions, because as you are saying, Minister Moro, right now the new government is facing these challenges from Sierra again.
Well, we have problems with violence in South America, not only in Brazil, but in other countries, usually high rates of homicide. It's a problem difficult to address. What I can say, I took this position with this compromise to change things. The first idea is to address grand corruption, because Brazil is probably the country who did more against corruption in the last 4 years than respecting every other country, but than any other country. And also Brazil cooperate with a lot of other countries, even in South America, in Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, with evidence about corruption committed by Brazilian enterprise abroad. But if you look at the details, you will realize that it was a work of law enforcement personnel, policemen, prosecutors, and judges. You haven't seen nothing substantial from the federal government. So I think this has to change. The federal government has the main responsibility to address this kind of problems. And between a lot of things that we intend to do, we want to present a bill in the beginning of the new Congress with measures against not only grand corruption, but also organized crime and violent crime. Because, to be honest, these things are related. Organized crime, how it was said here, use bribes to escape justice. Organized crime, a great part of homicides in Brazil is related to drug trafficking, to commercial disputes involving drugs. So if you have to deal with the problem, you have to deal with these 3 points. I hope that it will work. That's my intention. But things don't change abruptly. We need to start a cyclus, a virtuous cycle in Brazil to change things. It will be a hard job. True, sometimes it's difficult even to get cooperation from law enforcement personnel inside of your own country. In Brazil, we have a classic problem. We have a federal police, we have a state police, and what's more complicated, we have in the States military police, and we have civil police, and sometimes they work together, and other times they don't even talk with each other because they don't rely in each other. So you have to build trust. Of course, sometimes, and I'm not speaking here about the situation in Brazil, we have a problem worldwide with corruption that affects not only high politicians, but public employees from a lot of branches of government, including police officers. So you have to build trust. Sometimes, let me say, these international conferences, they are good opportunities to meet people. Then later you can build a strong relationship. I met him yesterday. We talked a lot.
To start a new partnership.
It was a good conversation.
Yeah, and of course your country is now also helping establishing these platforms on the South American continent to bring the forces together. I mean, these are the practical examples that have impact in individual cases, but also what I mentioned, having this sustainable impact and really trying to reduce a phenomena and not to cut, chop one head after the other, and it's coming back like the Hydra phenomena.
And you don't need to start with, for example, huge cases of organized crime or big cases of corruption. You could start with small cases at the boundaries of each country. Then you start doing something. We have for years mutual agreements with some countries like Argentina, Paraguay, Colombia, but we have never had a joint theme. Well, you have to start it. Then we will build more, you will build stronger relationship between the police of the two countries.
So on this positive note, I'll have to wrap up just saying, of course, we've seen the scale, the magnitude, the different faces of organized crime, but also I think now it's a positive development. I think understanding that the bad guys cooperate, the good guys have to cooperate. And I would just like to take these disruptive models that Mr. Moro was putting at the table further, at least as a brainstorming, how could we have the global agreement, but also more practical experiences that we could just work from. So start like that. So thank you so much for the panelists and for the audience, and we hope to continue this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You want any studies?
I have to run.